The bright lights of the Galactic Science Council chamber made Jack squint as he stood before the assembled alien representatives. Their worried whispers echoed through the vast hall, filled with beings from across the galaxy. Some floated in special atmosphere chambers, others sat in pools of liquid, and a few appeared as mere shadows in crystalline containers. The head counselor, a tall being with iridescent scales, leaned forward from the high podium. "Engineer Jack, you understand that this mission has a very high chance of failure. Nexus 6 is classified as a death zone planet. No non-human species has survived on its surface for more than 2 standard days." Jack stood straight, his weathered face showing no sign of concern. His simple brown uniform looked out of place among the elaborate environmental suits and shimmering robes of the alien diplomats. "With all due respect, Counselor, I've read the planet reports. The conditions sound similar to some of Earth's more challenging environments." A ripple of disbelief passed through the chamber. One of the floating orb-like beings moved forward, its translator crackling to life. "But the acid rains, the toxic atmosphere, the temperature swings that could crack steel, and the predators. Oh, the predators." Jack couldn't help but smile. "Sounds like a typical Tuesday in Australia, minus the acid rain. Though I've dealt with chemical spills that come close." His attempt at humor made several aliens recoil in horror. The head counselor raised a limb for silence. "You humans, always making light of deadly situations, but this is why we chose you. Your species evolved on what we consider a death world. Your planet's gravity, weather patterns, and variety of predators should have prevented intelligent life from emerging. Yet here you stand." Jack nodded, remembering his training days in Earth's harshest environments. The frozen peaks of the Himalayas, the scorching Sahara Desert, the crushing depths of the ocean. Humans had conquered them all. "The mineral formations you've discovered on Nexus 6 could revolutionize space travel. Someone needs to study them up close. I've been building shelters and surviving in impossible places since I was a kid." The council chamber erupted in confused chatter. The concept of letting children practice survival skills horrified many species. The head counselor had to wave several times for quiet. "Very well," the scaled being declared. "You will be provided with our most advanced survival equipment. A rescue ship will remain in orbit, ready to extract you at the first sign-off." "Actually," Jack interrupted, earning more shocked whispers, "I'd prefer to rely mainly on basic tools. High-tech equipment can fail. Simple tools are more reliable." He patted the worn leather tool belt at his waist. "Give me a good knife, some rope, basic medical supplies, and my old tools. That's all I need to start." The orb-like being actually dimmed its glow in shock. But the standard survival pod alone costs more than a small spaceship. You can't just use primitive tools on a death world." "That's exactly what I plan to do," Jack replied firmly. "Humanity didn't get where it is today by relying on perfect conditions or fancy equipment. We got here by adapting, improvising, and overcoming. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one." The head counselor studied Jack for a long moment, multiple eyes blinking in sequence. "Your confidence either speaks of supreme skill or supreme foolishness, perhaps both. But you are correct. Your species has proven remarkably adaptable. The mission is approved." As Jack left the chamber, he heard the aliens still discussing his strange request. They couldn't understand why anyone would choose simple tools over advanced technology. But Jack knew better. He'd seen too many people fail because they trusted their equipment more than their own skills and judgment. In his quarters, he carefully packed his old, trusted tools, ones that had saved his life many times before. The worn hammer passed down from his father, the versatile knife that had helped him survive countless wilderness expeditions, the basic medical kit he'd assembled from experience. Others might see these items as primitive, but to Jack, they were proof of humanity's greatest strength, the ability to shape any environment to their needs. Tomorrow he would land on Nexus 6. The aliens expected him to die or call for rescue within days. Jack planned to prove them wrong, not just by surviving, but by thriving. After all, that's what humans did best: turn deadly environments into homes. The drop pod shook violently as it entered Nexus 6's atmosphere. Jack gripped his seat, watching red warnings flash across the pod's display. Something was wrong with the landing thrusters. The pod's computer blared alerts in multiple alien languages, none of which helped him now. Through the small window, he saw the planet's surface rushing up to meet him. The sky burned orange, filled with thick clouds that glowed with electrical charges. A massive storm system loomed on the horizon, its clouds tinted green by the planet's peculiar atmosphere. Landing thrusters failing. The computer announced calmly. Survival probability minimal. Jack smiled grimly. We'll see about that. He braced himself as the pod spun out of control. The backup parachutes deployed with a sharp jerk, but the acid rain was already eating through them. He had seconds to make a decision. Up in orbit, the alien rescue ship's crew watched in horror as the pod spiraled toward the ground. Their sensors showed the parachutes dissolving and the pod systems failing one by one. Many turned away, not wanting to watch the humans' death. The pod slammed into the rocky ground with a crash that echoed across the barren landscape. It bounced once, twice, then skidded to a stop near a cliff face. Silence followed. The alien observers waited for the inevitable emergency signal. None came. Inside the mangled pod, Jack pushed away the airbag and checked himself for injuries. A few bruises, maybe a cracked rib, but he was alive. Most of the high-tech equipment was destroyed, just as he'd feared. But his tool belt was intact, and his backpack had survived. That was all he needed. He pulled on his environment suit, a simple design he'd modified himself, more durable than the complex ones the aliens had offered. The helmet sealed with a satisfying click. Jack took his first breath of filtered air and checked the suit's integrity. Everything held. The pod's door was jammed. Jack grabbed his old crowbar, a tool the aliens had laughed at, and forced it open. Hot, toxic air rushed in as he stepped onto the planet's surface for the first time. The landscape before him was both beautiful and terrifying. Sharp rock formations stretched toward the orange sky, their surfaces scarred by constant acid rain. In the distance, something large moved among the rocks, its multiple limbs leaving deep marks in the ground. The ground itself was a patchwork of different colored minerals, some glowing faintly. Jack's first priority was shelter. The storm on the horizon was moving fast, and he needed protection before it hit. He studied the cliff face near where he crashed. The rock layers told him a story. This area had once been underwater. That meant there might be. Yes, there it was, a natural cave opening, partially hidden behind fallen rocks. Perfect. The aliens watching from orbit probably couldn't even see it. Their sensors would be looking for artificial structures, not natural shelters. He worked quickly, clearing a path to the cave entrance. The local gravity was slightly stronger than Earth's, making every movement more demanding. Sweat rolled down his face inside his helmet. His cracked rib protested with each heavy rock he moved, but he ignored the pain. Something screeched in the distance, closer this time. Jack glanced up to see 3 flying creatures circling overhead. Their wings looked like stretched leather, and their bodies glowed with the same bioluminescence he'd seen in the rocks. They were hunting him. The first drops of acid rain began to fall as Jack finally reached the cave entrance. He ducked inside just as the storm hit in full force. The rain sizzled against the rocks outside, filling the air with acrid smoke. The flying creatures scattered, seeking their own shelter. Inside the cave, Jack turned on his helmet light and inspected his new home. The cave went deep into the cliff, with several smaller tunnels branching off. The rock type would help neutralize the acid that might seep in. There were even some crystal formations that gave off a faint light, a potential energy source if he could figure out how to use them. He set down his pack and took out his father's old hammer. Time to get to work. he said to himself, his voice echoing in the cave. Above him, the alien observers continued to watch, amazed that he was still alive. They had no idea that for Jack, the real work was just beginning. The first night on Nexus 6 tested everything Jack knew about survival. The cave protected him from the acid rain, but the temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on his suit's outer layer. He needed heat, and he needed it fast. The aliens watching from orbit were puzzled as they observed him gathering pieces of his broken pod. Their confusion grew when he began breaking apart the glowing crystal formations in the cave. What they didn't understand was that Jack had recognized something familiar in those crystals. They reminded him of the heat-storing rocks he'd once studied in Earth's volcanic regions. Jack arranged the crystals in a circle, connecting them to the pod's broken power cell. A spark jumped between the crystals, and they began to glow brighter, giving off steady waves of heat. He smiled behind his helmet visor. The aliens had countless reports about these crystals, but had never thought to use them this way. First rule of survival, Jack muttered to himself as he warmed his hands near the crystal heater. Use what you have. His old instructor's words echoed in his mind. On Earth, he'd learned to make fire in the rain, build shelters in blizzards, and find water in deserts. This was just another puzzle to solve. The next challenge was water. The acid rain outside would kill him in seconds, but he needed liquid to survive. Jack studied the cave walls where condensation was forming. The moisture wasn't acidic. The cave rocks were naturally neutralizing it. He set up a simple condensation trap using pieces of his suit's emergency blanket, letting the water drip into a container salvaged from the pod. Movement at the cave entrance caught his attention. One of the flying creatures from earlier had landed and was watching him. In the crystal's light, Jack could see it clearly now. Its skin was transparent, showing internal organs that pulsed with bioluminescence. The creature tilted its head, studying Jack with multiple eyes that glowed like tiny moons. Instead of reaching for a weapon, Jack stayed still and observed. The creature wasn't acting aggressive. It was curious. It took a few steps into the cave, then backed away when it felt the heat from the crystals. That was interesting. These creatures avoided heat. Up in the observation ship, the alien scientists were frantically taking notes. The human was doing something unprecedented. He was learning from the local wildlife instead of trying to fight it. Their sensors showed more of the flying creatures gathering outside the cave, all keeping a safe distance from the heat source. Jack spent the next few hours setting up his base camp. He used rocks and pod debris to create barriers that would channel any acid water away from his sleeping area. The crystal heater served multiple purposes: warmth, light, and now he knew it would keep predators at bay. He even managed to rig up a basic air filtration system using his suit's spare filters and the natural airflow in the cave. The aliens watching him grew more confused by his methods. They saw him testing different local plants by rubbing them on his suit's material, checking for reactions. He was creating a map on the cave wall using charred pod pieces, marking safe zones and danger areas. When he found a patch of soil near the cave entrance, he pulled out a small container of earth seeds from his pack. "Let's see how you like this place," he said to the seeds as he planted them in the soil. The aliens couldn't believe what they were seeing. The human was trying to grow earth plants on a death world. It was either madness or brilliance. They couldn't decide which. As the planet's sun set, casting an eerie purple glow through the toxic clouds, Jack sat back to assess his progress. He had shelter, heat, a water source, and the beginnings of a sustainable food supply. The local predators seemed to respect boundaries, and he was learning more about the planet's patterns with each passing hour. He took out his old notebook, paper, another thing the aliens couldn't understand him carrying, and began sketching plans for expanding his shelter. Tomorrow he would need to find more crystals, test the soil composition, and maybe try communicating with those flying creatures again. But for now, he had accomplished something the aliens thought impossible. He had survived his first day on Nexus 6, and he did it using nothing but simple tools and human ingenuity. After a week on Nexus 6, Jack's cave had transformed into something the alien observers could hardly believe. Using nothing but basic tools and materials found on the planet, he had created what he called a living shelter, a space that worked with the hostile environment instead of fighting against it. The entrance to his cave now featured a series of channels carved into the rock. When acid rain fell, it flowed through these channels into collection pools where the naturally neutralizing minerals turned it into safe, drinkable water. The aliens watched in amazement as Jack used the toxic rain that had killed so many of their explorers as his main water source. Inside the cave, Jack had expanded his crystal heating system into something more complex. He discovered that by arranging different colored crystals in specific patterns, he could control the temperature in different areas of the cave. The blue crystals absorbed heat, while the red ones released it slowly. He used this to create a natural cooling system for storing food and a warm area for sleeping. The flying creatures, which Jack now called glowings, had become regular visitors. They seemed fascinated by his activities, often perching on nearby rocks to watch him work. Jack noticed they avoided certain areas of the cave system and used this information to map out potentially dangerous zones. The alien scientists couldn't believe their eyes when they saw him communicating with the creatures using simple hand signals and light patterns from his crystal arrays. "You're not so different from Earth's bats," Jack said to a glowing that had landed near his workbench, a flat rock where he repaired and modified his tools. The creature tilted its head, its organs pulsing with soft light. It had learned that Jack would often share small bits of his processed food if it helped warn him about approaching storms. The earth seeds he had planted were growing, despite the alien soil. Jack had mixed the soil with crushed minerals from the cave, creating a balanced growing medium. The plants were different here, stronger, with thicker leaves and a faint glow of their own. They were adapting to Nexus 6, just like him. One day, while expanding his cave system, Jack broke through into a larger cavern. The aliens watching expected him to retreat when their sensors detected dangerous gas levels. Instead, they saw him throw a burning piece of cloth into the chamber. The fire showed him which way the air was flowing, and he used this information to create a natural ventilation system throughout his entire shelter. His biggest challenge came from the large predators that roamed the surface. They were massive creatures with armor-like shells, attracted to the heat and light from his cave. But Jack had learned from watching the glowings. He arranged crystals at specific points around his shelter, creating a network of light and heat that confused the predator's hunting instincts. They learned to avoid his area completely. The alien scientist had given up trying to understand how he knew which rocks were safe to use and which would crumble. They couldn't grasp how he predicted the planet's deadly storms hours before their advanced sensors could detect them. Jack was using knowledge passed down through generations of human builders and survivors, reading signs in nature that their technology couldn't see. His latest project puzzled them the most. He was building something in the cave's main chamber using a combination of strong local fibers and processed crystal dust. The aliens thought he was wasting time with primitive crafts until they realized he was creating an insulated suit that could withstand the planet's acid rain. He tested small pieces of the material by exposing them to the rain, making adjustments until he found the perfect combination. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways," Jack said to himself as he worked, remembering how his grandfather had taught him to weave protective clothing from natural materials. The aliens didn't understand that humans had spent thousands of years learning to survive in hostile environments before they developed advanced technology. As Jack stood at his cave entrance that evening, watching the strange double sunset of Nexus 6, he felt a sense of accomplishment. The planet was still trying to kill him every day, but he had turned its weapons into tools. His shelter was more than just a place to hide. It was becoming a home, built with the same basic principles that humans had used since they first learned to survive on their own deadly world. 2 weeks into his stay on Nexus 6, Jack made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring a deeper section of his cave system, He found a large chamber filled with shimmering black crystals. The alien scientists watching him expected the usual careful testing process, but Jack recognized something about their formation pattern. "Just like the coal seams back home," he muttered, running his hand along the crystal wall. These black crystals weren't just for heat or light. They stored energy. Within hours, Jack had set up a basic power system that made the alien observers question everything they knew about primitive technology. He connected the black crystals to his existing crystal network using simple copper wiring salvaged from his pod. The energy transfer was more efficient than any power system the aliens had tried to use on the planet's surface. Jack hadn't needed complex equations or advanced technology. He'd simply copied the natural patterns he found in the crystal formations. The glowings seemed especially attracted to the black crystal chamber. Jack noticed they would rest there between hunting trips, their bioluminescent organs pulsing in sync with the crystal's energy field. He started keeping his food stores in this chamber, and to his surprise, nothing rotted. The energy field was naturally preserving his supplies. His earth plants had grown into something new and strange. The alien soil and crystal energy had changed them, creating hybrid plants that glowed softly in the dark and produced larger, more nutritious fruit. Jack carefully collected and stored the seeds. These new plants were perfectly adapted to Nexus 6's hostile environment. The alien scientists were baffled when Jack began spreading crushed black crystals around his cave entrance. They couldn't understand why until the next acid storm hit. The crystal dust created a magnetic field that deflected most of the acid rain, protecting his shelter better than any energy shield they had ever designed. One morning, Jack watched as a group of young glowings played near his cave. They were picking up small rocks and dropping them, apparently learning to judge wind patterns. It reminded him of young eagles learning to hunt. He spent the next few days studying their behavior, adding their flight patterns to his growing map of the planet's air currents. "You're better than any weather satellite," he told a glowing that often perched near his workbench. He had named it Scout, noticing how it always returned to warn him before major storms. The aliens watching couldn't believe that a human had formed a working relationship with one of Nexus 6's most mysterious species. Jack's latest project involved creating a network of small gardens throughout his cave system. He used different crystal combinations to create various environmental conditions, testing which worked best for different plants. Some chambers mimicked Earth's climate, while others embraced Nexus 6's unique conditions. The result was a sustainable food source that no alien had thought possible on this world. The alien scientists were particularly interested in his water purification system. Jack had expanded his original design, creating a series of pools that used layers of local minerals to filter and clean the acid rain. The process was so effective that he could now safely store several weeks' worth of clean water. His protective suit design had evolved too. By studying how the glowing's transparent skin reflected the acid rain, he had improved his fiber weaving technique. The new suit material was lighter but stronger, allowing him to explore further from his shelter. He even began teaching some of the braver alien observers how to make it, though they struggled to match his craftsmanship. One day, while Jack was tending to his gardens, Scout and several other glowings led him to a new cave opening. Inside, he found exactly what the Galactic Science Council had sent him to study: the rare mineral formations that could revolutionize space travel. But he'd found them through cooperation with local life forms, not through advanced scanning technology. The aliens watching from orbit had to admit that Jack had done more than just survive on Nexus 6. He had proven that the simplest solutions were often the best, that working with nature was better than fighting it, and that human adaptability was far more impressive than they had imagined. His primitive techniques had accomplished what their advanced technology could not, turning a death world into a home. The warning came from Scout first. The glowing burst into Jack's cave, its bioluminescent organs flashing in a pattern he'd never seen before. Moments later, his makeshift weather sensors began showing readings that made his blood run cold. A storm was coming, bigger than anything he'd faced on Nexus 6 so far. The alien observation ship's sensors confirmed his fears. A massive storm system was forming, pulling together three smaller storms into what their computers predicted would be a planet-wide disaster. They immediately sent him an evacuation order. No structure had ever survived a storm of this magnitude on Nexus 6. Jack looked around at the home he'd built over the past 3 weeks. The gardens he'd cultivated, the crystal energy system he'd perfected, the water purification pools that were finally working at peak efficiency. More importantly, he thought about Scout and the other glowings that had come to trust him. They needed shelter too. Evacuation order denied. He transmitted back to the ship. The aliens were shocked. Their sensors showed acid rain concentrations that could melt through metal, wind speeds that could lift rocks, and temperature swings that would shatter most materials. But Jack had a plan. He had less than 6 hours before the storm hit. Jack worked faster than he ever had, putting into practice everything he'd learned about Nexus 6. He broke down his larger crystal arrays, repositioning them to create a protective energy field around the cave entrance. The black crystal dust barrier was reinforced with a new layer of processed mineral paste that would harden when exposed to acid. The glowings seemed to understand his purpose. They'd brought him pieces of their own nests, a fibrous material he'd never seen before. Jack quickly realized it was naturally acid-resistant and incredibly strong. He wove it into his existing barriers, creating a flexible layer that would bend with the storm winds rather than break. Inside the cave, he moved his gardens to the deepest chambers, using the black crystal's energy field to protect them. His water storage systems were sealed with extra layers of neutralizing minerals. The aliens watched in amazement as he transformed his shelter into a fortress using nothing but natural materials and simple tools. The storm hit just as the planet's sun set. The sound was like nothing Jack had ever heard, a screaming howl that made the very rocks vibrate. Acid rain fell in sheets so thick they looked solid, eating away at the planet's surface. The temperature dropped so fast that rocks cracked and shattered outside. But inside Jack's cave, his crystal heating system maintained a steady temperature. The new barriers flexed and held against the wind, the glowing nest material proving stronger than any artificial fiber. Scout and about 20 other glowings huddled in the black crystal chamber, their light pulsing in sync with the crystal's energy field, somehow strengthening it. The alien scientists couldn't believe their sensor readings. While the storm destroyed everything else on the surface, the area around Jack's cave remained stable. His layered defenses weren't just holding. They were actually getting stronger. The acid rain was being absorbed by his mineral paste barrier, hardening it further. The wind patterns he'd learned from the glowings helped him position deflectors that broke up the strongest gusts. Hours passed. The storm raged on. Jack moved through his shelter, adjusting crystal alignments, reinforcing weak points, and comforting the glowings. He noticed that the creature's bioluminescence was affecting his barriers, creating an additional protective layer that his alien observers couldn't even detect with their instruments. When the storm finally passed, nearly a full day later, the planet's surface was transformed. Valleys had been carved by the acid rain. Rock formations had been shattered by the temperature changes, and most of the local plant life had been destroyed. But Jack's cave shelter stood firm, a testament to human ingenuity and the power of working with nature instead of against it. The aliens were stunned. According to their calculations, nothing should have survived that storm. But Jack had done more than survive. He created a safe haven for himself and the local life forms. Using simple tools and natural materials, he'd accomplished what their most advanced technology had failed to do. As Jack stood at his cave entrance, Survey Scout perched on his shoulder. He looked at the changed landscape and smiled. The storm had proven something he'd always believed, that the best technology wasn't always the most complex, and that understanding your environment was more important than trying to dominate it. 3 months after the Great Storm, Jack's shelter had become the center of an unprecedented research mission. The cave system, once a simple survival shelter, now hosted teams of alien scientists who came to study what they called the human approach. Jack found it amusing that his basic survival techniques had caused such a stir in the galactic scientific community. The Galactic Science Council had formally declared his methods revolutionary. They were particularly interested in how he had turned the planet's deadly features into resources. His water purification system, created from simple mineral layers, was being adapted for use on other hostile worlds. The crystal energy network he built with basic tools was proving more efficient than most modern power systems. Jack stood at his cave entrance, watching alien researchers carefully document his garden chambers. His hybrid plants had survived the storm and grown stronger, producing food that could sustain life even in Nexus 6's harsh conditions. Scout perched nearby, seemingly amused by the visitors who tried to understand its relationship with the human. "I still don't understand," a floating orb-like scientist said to Jack. "How did you know the glowings would help strengthen your storm barriers? Our sensors couldn't even detect that energy pattern until you showed us where to look." Jack smiled, remembering the storm. "I didn't know for sure," he admitted, "but I'd learned to trust them. Sometimes you have to work with what you don't fully understand." This concept seemed to disturb the alien scientist, whose species relied entirely on precise calculations and proven theories. The changes weren't just happening on Nexus 6. Word had spread through the galaxy about the human who turned a Deathworld into a research station using nothing but simple tools and observation. The Galactic Academy had created a new course called Practical Survival Engineering, with Jack's methods as the core curriculum. Students from various species were learning that sometimes the simplest solution was the most effective. His crystal energy system had sparked particular interest. The aliens had spent years trying to harness Nexus 6's crystals using complex technology, while Jack had succeeded by copying patterns he saw in nature. Now, ships were being redesigned with similar simple but effective systems, making space travel more reliable and efficient. The glowings had become unofficial ambassadors between humans and their species. After seeing how Jack worked with them, other researchers began studying Earth's history of animal partnerships. They were amazed to learn about humans working with dogs, horses, and other animals throughout their development. The concept of cooperating with local life forms instead of trying to control them was revolutionary to many alien species. One morning, Jack found a group of young alien researchers attempting to repair their equipment using simple tools instead of their usual advanced technology. They had torn pages from his notebook pinned to the cave wall, studying his sketches and notes. The sight made him smile. They were finally learning that technology was a tool, not a solution. The rare minerals that had originally brought Jack to Nexus 6 were being harvested now, but not with the massive mining machines the aliens had planned to use. Instead, they followed his lead, working with the planet's natural cycles and the guidance of the glowings to find and collect the resources safely. It was slower than their original plan, but far more sustainable. As Jack walked through his expanded cave system, now a maze of research stations and growing chambers, he remembered his first day on the planet. The aliens had expected him to die or give up. Instead, he'd proven that human adaptability was more valuable than any advanced technology. Scout landed on his shoulder as he reached the original chamber, where he'd first set up his crystal heater. The simple circle of crystals was still there, preserved as a reminder of how it all started. Alien students often gathered around it, amazed that such a basic setup had led to such significant discoveries. Sometimes, Jack told a group of visiting scientists, "The best way forward is to step back and look at things simply." He watched as Scout flew to its favorite perch near the black crystals. "Your technology is impressive, but don't forget that every advanced civilization started with simple tools and observation." The aliens were finally beginning to understand what humans had known all along, that true advancement came not from rejecting the past, but from building on its lessons. Jack's legacy wasn't just a set of survival techniques. It was a new way of thinking that was spreading across the galaxy, one simple solution at a time.